All right, so this is the moment you've all been waiting for, the time in Econ 101 when we get to cover supply and demand. Now, I know that many of you have taken an economics course in high school. You may have already learned this before, but we're going to cover this as if it's the first time that you are seeing this material so that those who have not taken this in high school can learn this for the first time and we can all be on the same page. Now, the activity that we did in class last week should be a good introduction to the fundamentals of supply and demand and the importance of understanding the role that supply and demand both play in generating price and determining market quantities. But in this video, we're going to dive into we're going to isolate supply and demand curves and think about what drives the behavior of individuals and market actors on both sides of that equation. All right, so I think that the benefits of this video and the video to come are threefold. Professionally, I think that it's important that you understand supply and demand so that you can understand the source of value. And I use value here in quotations because there are often services or goods on the market which have a high price that we may not think of as being especially valuable in terms of how it matters to our ability to thrive and survive. That Wall Street traders and venture capitalists in Manhattan earn salaries much higher than many doctors. However, if we were on a desert island, any of us would choose to be on that island with a physician rather than a stock trader. That has more inherent value to human lives. However, when we think of value on an open market, we often think of that being reflected through price. And if we want to understand what determines price, then we need to understand supply and demand. When we think about making the world a better place, I think that you'll need to understand supply and demand so that you can leverage market forces to achieve a desired outcome. So if our goal is to make a particular technology or particular good or service cheaper, then we need to understand how we can drive the price down in that market so that those who are consuming that good or service may do so more affordably. And finally, this really is fundamental to this class, and it's one of the primary models that you're going to learn. So it is going to be a service to you to be able to differentiate between demand and the quantity demanded, and the same goes for supply. Differentiate between supply and the quantity supplied, as misinterpreting or confusing those two are going to lead you to wrong conclusions about what is going to happen to price and market quantities. Okay, so as we begin our conversation about demand, I think it's helpful to start with this textbook definition of demand, noting that demand is the amount of some good or service consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. And this definition is important because there are a couple key words here that we need to focus on. The first is that we are thinking about consumers, that this is going to be reflecting the preferences and needs and behaviors of those who are buying, those who are parting with money or parting with a resource which they have to acquire more of another resource, that it reflects both what they are willing to pay and what they are able to pay. And if consumers are able to buy anything, then there is no scarcity, nothing has value, we don't need economics. And so by there being limited ability to purchase something, that is really what is going to determine how consumers make trade-offs in response to incentives, and we need that part of the equation. Similarly, we also need to think about demand as representing consumer behavior at each price. This isn't just noting the amount of some good or service that is bought at a single price. It's for every price possible. And when we take this approach, we notice that demand then reflects both needs and wants. And it may refer to a good or service which is optional or one which is necessary for life. We can also think of other ways of summarizing this information with a word other than demand, and probably the most common of which is the marginal benefit. That thinking about the marginal principle being that consumers make decisions about a little bit more, a little bit less. They make them incrementally rather than all or nothing. The demand curve or just the demand function is going to give us information about the benefit which consumers receive from just a little bit more or a little bit less of the good or service. So we can think of, in addition to the word demand here, we may also see demand be referred to as the marginal benefit, which we'll abbreviate as MB, or we may think of it as representing the consumer's willingness to pay, which we will abbreviate WTP. And really, all three of these concepts are going to be important for better understanding what demand is actually reflecting. So there are two more points about demand that are absolutely essential for you to understand. And I think you should probably refer back to this part of this video if you ever get confused about demand as we go through this class. The first is the law of demand, which states that a rise in price of a good or service almost always decreases the quantity demanded of that good or service. So this is just common sense, right? If you have limited resources, if you're only making $30,000 a year and you need to use those resources wisely to purchase as many of your wants and needs as you can, then if something becomes more expensive, you're going to consume less of it, all else equal. And it's important here that we note that this says almost always. That is the textbook definition of the law of demand. Really, unless you go on to study advanced economics or intermediate microeconomic theory, which if you're a business and economics major, you probably will, we can cross out this almost because that really only applies to like a few specific cases, and just use your common sense and intuition that if something becomes more expensive, we're going to consume less of it. If something becomes cheaper, all else equal, we'll probably buy more of it. And it's important to focus here on that term, all else equal, and the phrase that economists use to summarize that information is ceteris paribus. And for any of you who have taken Latin out there, I've heard that in Latin there's no such thing as a soft C as there is in the word celery, that there was only hard C's as in the word cat. And so people will say that the real way to pronounce this is ceteris paribus, but you won't hear too many economists say that. But if you're a Latin snob, that's just something to keep in mind. But remember, that phrase means all else equal, which is going to be how we're going to understand market forces as driving price and quantities. So it's also incredibly important that we're able to differentiate between demand and quantity demanded. Remember, demand is telling us how consumers are willing and able to pay for goods and services at every price possible, whereas the quantity demanded is more of just how they respond to a single price. That's the quantity demanded when the price is $10 may be $400 or something like that. Well, this will be more clear in the following slides, but this is also an incredibly important distinction for you to be able to make as you go on with this class. So as we noted in the videos in week 1, we can visualize information in 3 ways. We can visualize it with tables. We can take that same information and view it in graphical form, or we could use an equation. And so we're going to try to use each of those 3 modalities for conceptualizing demand and the law of demand. And we're going to start off by looking at a table, as I feel like this makes the law of demand very clear. So the law of demand here is captured by the fact that when price increases, as we go down and price gets larger, 20 cents larger in each row, that demand is going to go in the other direction, that demand gets larger as we go up. that they have a negative relationship, and that the larger quantity demanded is, the lower the price is. And so the quantity demanded is the value at a particular row. The quantity demanded when the price is $1 is 800. The quantity demanded when the price is $1.60 is going to be 550. Whereas this whole table is going to represent demand itself. And so demand is capturing the quantity demanded at every price, whereas quantity demanded is just at a particular price. So we can view that same information graphically. We can see that as price decreases, we're going to see an increase in the quantity demanded. And once again, this is just intuitive, that if milk is cheaper, then more people will buy milk. I've been told I pronounce my I's like E's and speak like a third grade Ohioan and say milk instead of milk. But you get the point here. So this is important to notice because it implies that demand has a downward slope, that we are always going to draw demand as sloping downwards, right? And we will go over this more in another video or two, but it's also important to notice that price is always on the vertical axis and quantity is always on the horizontal axis. Now, quantity may be a word that you haven't seen before this week, and this just means amount. It is a number, though I guess that looks like a hashtag, seeing that we're using Twitter and all, but I want you to think of the horizontal axis as just reflecting the total amount of the good or service which is traded on the market. Now, there are two ways that we can read a demand curve. We can either start with the price or we can start with the quantity. So we can say that, and here it's going to be very helpful to think back to those other definitions of demand that we considered a couple slides ago, that demand, which we'll use a D here for, also equals the marginal benefit and also equals willingness to pay. And if we start by thinking about the value on the horizontal axis first, let's say 600, then we can see that for the 600 millionth gallon of milk, the willingness to pay is, $1.40. Now, this is the same thing as saying that the marginal benefit of that 600 millionth gallon of milk is $1.40. That is how much benefit that is bringing to society by trade of that very last 600 millionth gallon of milk. Now, if we start by reading the price first, then we can say at a price of $1.80, then there are 500 million gallons of milk demanded. And so we can either look at the price first or we can look at the quantity first, and we can then make inferences or make conclusions about what demand is telling us. And both ways of reading this graph are going to be helpful for you as you understand or need to analyze changes in demand. Moving on now to discussing supply, which is the other half of the equation and equally as important, even though in this class we'll probably spend more time thinking about demand. But we can think of supply, once again, with that textbook definition, that it's the amount of some good or service a producer is willing to supply at each price. So once again here, I was referring to producer decisions across the entire range of possible prices. And instead of being based in response to needs and wants of consumers, supply is based on responses to opportunities for profit. And just as we could think of the demand curve as being represented by other letters, specifically WTP for willingness to pay or marginal benefit, we can think of supply as equaling the marginal cost when we assume perfect competition. So we will relax this assumption of perfect competition. We'll actually provide more detail what this means in another video or two, but we'll relax this assumption next week. But for now, it's helpful to think of supply as representing the incremental cost of one more unit of production to the suppliers. So just as we thought of those two other additional notes about demand, we can make the same inferences about supply. So I'm going to state what these two important notes are here at the beginning, and I want to add a comment about the first one when we're done discussing them. So just as we think of demand as always being downward sloping, we can generally make the same assumptions about supply, that supply follows a behavior where a higher price leads to a higher quantity supplied and a lower price leads to a lower quantity supplied. That producers are going to be more willing to produce a greater quantity of a good when there is a greater opportunity for profit. That when the difference between the price which they can command for the good which they're selling is greater, then it makes more sense to produce more units of whatever they're supplying to the market. Also important is that supply is not the same thing as quantity supplied. That supply represents the decisions of producers at every price possible, and quantity supplied is going to represent the decisions of producers at one single given price. Now, the last thing that I want to note is that this law of supply, I should really highlight these quotes here, because in certain circles of economics, they'll argue that this may not really exist, that there's not a standard rule that represents the law of supply, such as there is the law of demand. We're not going to dive into that in this class, but if this interests you, there's definitely some background research which you could do to get into that heterodox, outside of the mainstream branch of economics, which would question this assumption a little bit more. But in this class, we are going to draw our supply curves as being upward sloping when we think of price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. So just as with demand, we can also think about the information in the supply curve as being represented both graphically in a tabular form or with an equation. And importantly here, we notice that as price increases as we move down this table, so too does the quantity supplied. That in response to greater prices and greater potential for profits, we see the quantity supplied on the market also increase. And so remember here that this whole table is going to tell us about supply. This whole table is our measure of supply. The value at each price, that at a price of $1.20, the quantity supplied is 550. That's going to be the quantity supplied. And lastly, just as with demand, we can read the supply curve in two different ways. We can read it horizontally and we can read it vertically. So if we start out, let's start out on the vertical axis, which remember is going to have price on it. Then we could say that at a price of $1.80 per gallon of milk, then there will be 680 million gallons of milk supplied. That if the price on the market, if you walk into the grocery store and you're able to pay $1.80 per gallon of milk, that based on this information, we would then assume that the total amount of milk available for purchase would be 680 million gallons. Now, we could also start our analysis by looking at the horizontal axis and noticing that for the 500 millionth gallon of milk, the marginal cost of production is $1. So remember, that is going to be MC. So marginal benefit represents the value of consumption to a consumer and is represented on a demand curve. Marginal cost is representing the incentives which are being provided to the producers and is captured by the supply curve. So in the next video, we are going to look at how these two curves interact and what outcomes that creates. So what happens at the intersection of supply and demand.